So I guess kind of those are the top two tiers, and again, those are not really tangible things. But from there, we've talked about obviously, the basics we're assuming are covered, right? So we have healthcare, we have some sort of retirement plan. We're kind of assuming those things are covered as part of basic compensation. And then you start to get into more of the tangible things, and this is the conversation that we were having this morning on Twitter. um, these things aren't necessarily expensive, but I think they have an incredible return on investment. And this is investing in your employees' environment. So whether you're allowing them to choose hardware that works for them, whether you give them a budget and they can buy a desk that feels good, or a chair that supports their needs, or just niceties around the office. Again, like, these are pennies on the dollar compared to what it costs to hire and keep a person employed. But the return on having an environment that your employees feel good going to work in every day is priceless in my mind.
Yeah. What are some of the things that stood out in responses you got to that?
So, I was expecting to hear, yeah, we cover, the basics, a laptop, a computer. One of the things that surprised me a little bit was the openness to choice in the hardware was a bit of a surprise to me, because when we've hired employees, and our most recent employee was no different. We said, "What do you want?" He's like, "Well, what do you mean?" I'm like, "Well, do you want a PC or your Mac? Do you want a laptop or a desktop?" He's like, "I don't understand." I'm like, "Well, we want you to pick what is going to feel good for you." It's like, I've never had an employer say that to me. They always said, "Well, this is our standard. Here's what you get. You get what you get." And so to hear that there are other employers out there saying, "Hey, no, like, we want you to choose what works for you," was really great to hear. I'm gonna actually pull up my feed and kind of go through some of the things that we were hearing. So lots of employers are either giving funds directly for needs, not necessarily needs, but things that they would be paying for anyway, like internet access, cell phones. So that wasn't too much of a shock. But then others saying, not only that, but we kind of have just a monthly stipend. So whether we want to, buy something for the office, to, anything really. It's like, I want plants in my office. It's gonna make me feel good. Or, maybe I use those funds and I buy, snacks or whatever. Or maybe I use those funds and I buy a subscription to a streaming service or a gym membership. And so again, I think that autonomy is great, right? It's one thing to say, here's like $50 and you have to spend it on X. I think it's another thing to say, here's $50, spend it on what's going to make your day more enjoyable. That goes to further expound on the value of that freedom and autonomy piece. And it's so incredibly valuable for employees to feel like they have um, those options. Scrolling through the feed here, there was a couple others that stood out. Companies, especially for developers, offering multiple large monitors, I think is a huge thing to do. And again, these are things that they'd be doing anyway in office, but that doesn't mean that it's a natural for them to do it for the home office setup. Yeah, lots of mentions of stipends to basically spend in certain areas to make life better. Lots of mentions of docking stations. I tried to use a docking station once. I didn't like it for some reason. So yeah, I mean, I think really you can prescribe lots of things, but giving, again, following that autonomy path of giving your team some funds that they can use and say, "Hey, we trust you to buy things that are going to make your job better, more efficient, happier in the work, in when you're doing the work," I think is awesome to hear. um One thing that I did want to call out and is of concern to me is, um, are companies not doing this because they're not sure what the next step is? And by that, I mean, we
Yeah, I'm
saw,
curious what you mean by that.
well, so we saw this at the beginning of the pandemic, and we saw this with lots of our clients where They were sitting at a kitchen table or a little card table in the corner, in a room that was not really meant for work, or an environment that seemed very, very temporary. And I would ask the questions out of curiosity, like, what are you thinking long term? And they're like, well, my employer says, we're going to be back in the office in a couple weeks, and this was the very start of the pandemic. It's like, we don't need to really even think about home office, but this is just really temporary. It's like a couple weeks, we'll be back in the office. And so, you know, to be fair, like, no one had an idea of how long this would stretch out, and how it would change things. But again, it was kind of that it's going to go back to the way things are. So it's not really worth investing or even thinking about how to make sure that they have a good setup. Fast forward 2 years later, they're still at the kitchen table working. And I'm saying, okay, it's been 2 years. What are you thinking about long-term plans so you have a more proper work setup at home? And the feedback is, well, now we're on the tail end of the pandemic. And so we're going to be back in the office soon. So everything's going to be back to normal. So it doesn't make sense now to like invest in a home office setup or how to do it properly, because we're just going to be back in the office. So that's my biggest concern, is that, yeah, we're hearing lots of really great things from people where their employers are doing it right. But I'm guessing that we're not hearing from the larger population of people whose employers are taking that approach of, well, everything's going to be back to the way it was soon, so it doesn't even make sense for us to get them off the kitchen table.